Okay, can anybody tell me what this animal is? Anyone? Yeah, great. So this is a pangolin. I actually took this picture myself of this pangolin at a rescue center in Vietnam a few years ago. And this particular pangolin had just been saved from illegal wildlife trade. And pangolins really are fascinating creatures. They're often referred to as scaly anteaters, with ants being their primary diet. And because of this, they play a really critical role in the ecosystem as pest controllers, where it's estimated they can consume as much as 200,000 insects per day. Pangolins also have a really vast geographical range that extends across 48 countries in Africa and Asia. But pangolins are really difficult to see in the wild. They're known to be shy and elusive creatures. They're also nocturnal. And when pangolins are under threat, they roll into a ball where they are protected by an outer layer of scales. But it's actually these scales that are to their detriment. And I'm not here today, actually, to talk to you about how precious the pangolins are in the wild, because, of course, all animals have a really important role to play. What I'm here to talk to you about today is what the pangolin represents for me. And that is a victim of how destructive organised crime can be. And in my job as a criminal intelligence analyst working on wildlife crime, this is usually how I see pangolins. So once pangolins have been illegally taken from the wild, they are killed, their meat is often consumed, and then their scales are processed and offered for sale, like we see here, like any other criminal commodity. And my journey into this world of wildlife crime started around 12 years ago, when I was exposed to a video about badger baiting. And if anybody here doesn't know what badger baiting is, really consider yourself lucky, because that was one of the most abhorrent things I think I've ever had to see in my whole life. And from that point onwards, I just decided I was going to try and use my skills and what I'd learned about fighting crime as a police analyst to trying to save wildlife. And when I first started working on wildlife crime 12 years ago, pangolins were not really considered to be threatened by illegal wildlife trade. But today, in 2021, they are the most trafficked mammal on the planet. And this is because of a relatively new surge in demand for their scales and its use in traditional Asian medicine that is now being met and fueled by organised crime. And I'll give you one example of that. In July this year, 196 sacks of pangolin scales were discovered and seized by customs in Nigeria. And here you can see that huge consignment, which weighed over 7 tons, that was packed and ready to be smuggled into Asia. And in order to gather a shipment of that size, scales need to be removed from 15,000 pangolins. So I'll just give you a moment to think about the entire operation that must have happened in the background in order to gather and process that number of scales. And this is just in one shipment. That particular shipment also was linked to a number of other high-value shipments that occurred in Nigeria over the past 10 years, where an estimated almost 800,000 pangolins have been removed from the wild to feed this growing demand in China and in Vietnam. And wildlife crime is a huge issue now. The involvement of organised crime facilitating wildlife crime at this level is a growing problem. And even in my job as a criminal intelligence analyst working on the numbers, I continue to be alarmed by the rate at which animals are being removed from the wild, often in highly distressing ways. I'll give you another example. So here we see a really healthy herd of elephants. There's probably around 70 individuals here. But recent analysis of ivory shipments found that the average weight of an ivory shipment today is 3.5 tons. And in order to collect a shipment of 3.5 tons of ivory, you need to remove ivory from 350 elephants. So that's about 5 times the number of elephants we see in this picture. And that's just one shipment, and trust me, they're not that rare. And wildlife crime and wildlife trafficking can take many different forms and occurs everywhere. It happens a lot here in Europe. We have a huge trade in reptiles here in Europe, a lot of which is being met through criminal means. We also, in Bulgaria specifically, have a continuing illegal trade in wild sturgeon, which is in huge demand for its meat and its caviar, which is sold often at incredibly high prices. And recent sampling of caviar found on sale in shops in Bulgaria found that around 1/4 was illegal. And of course, that also has a huge impact on the wild populations. And for context, Bulgaria and Romania are the only countries in the EU that have viable wild populations of sturgeon. So everything has an impact. And the problem we're faced today is really growing, as I said. So we need to go back a little bit. So if we go back to the pangolin then, how does the pangolin go from happily living in the forest of Central Africa to becoming an ingredient in a traditional medicine in Asia? And can you even begin to imagine the logistics, the coordination, and the organization needed to facilitate that entire supply chain that crosses 2 continents and successfully passes through many different law enforcement layers intended to stop it? So intelligence analysis, which I specialize in, is essentially about seeking to understand the functioning of organized crime networks, such as those that are involved in pangolin smuggling. So what we wish to do is to identify the key individuals to target to bring down that network. So what we do is we look for common patterns and connections in crime data. And analysis is really like pulling together different parts of a puzzle. And as we're talking about organized crime, it's generally accepted we will never get a full understanding of what's happening. A lot of stuff we'll never know about. But it's through making estimations and predictions about how and why something is happening, we can gain a much greater insight about how to intervene and tackle the issue. So the way in which we often approach a really complex problem like this is to break it down into meaningful chunks. And one technique we use for that is called the 5WH. So that's the who, the what, the where, the when, the how, and the why. And that's a really simple but very effective technique to bring in together all the different components of what is often a very complex problem. So I'll try and cover some of those components today. So to start with the where. So here for pangolin trafficking, we're talking about trade routes. So the routes that's used to get product A to point B. And for analysis, there's a lot of really useful information we can gain from looking at trade routes. And we will often seek to look at why a particular route has been chosen and why another one hasn't, for example. And a lot of people think that that is determined by picking the fastest route. And I can tell you that's not the answer at all. It's absolutely influenced by evading law enforcement detection. So here we can see 4 different years, and there's a number of persistent routes that appear again and again. So Nigeria and Vietnam, for example, there'll be reasons for that. There's also, we can see in 2019, a shipment actually went through the EU, Romania more specifically. That was from DRC. And back in 2016, we had an earlier case in Bulgaria also of pangolins being smuggled through the country. So that might suggest to us there's some European involvement, for example. So that's really useful. And what often happens in this field as well is where law enforcement actions step up and shipments become detected more often and seized more often, traffickers will reroute their shipments through other countries. And we call that geographical crime displacement, and it is incredibly relevant in this field, and hence why it's so important for intelligence to monitor those trends, to report on those trends, and stay ahead of what's happening on the ground. Okay, and then the next component is the how. So this is essentially the way in which crime is occurring. And if we think about trafficking, we need to know the type of transportation that's being used and why. Is it being shipped by boat or is it by air? What can the packaging of how the shipment was found tell us about the network and their accessibilities? Was it hidden amongst a particular material, for example, and where did that material come from? And like drug trafficking, a variety of concealment methods are used to conceal shipments, often in very creative ways. Traffickers will also take advantage of vulnerabilities in the shipping process as well, and all of that is to enable them to hide and disguise the true nature of their shipment. So by analysing concealment methods, we can learn a lot more about crime. So here we have an example of something we call a crime series. And here we can see that this particular crime series demonstrates a commonality in the method in which crime is being committed. So this is ivory here for this example that's been chopped into little parts, that's then hidden in these tailor-made vests that then is worn by the courier. And I think there was about 28 or 29 different cases like this. So this is really useful for us. It helps us to tie together a whole different series of crimes or events. And we can then attribute that, call that a crime series, and attribute that to an individual or to a set of individuals. And it's really insightful for us. We also take advantage as analysts of anything paperwork, any tiny bits of information, so we will go through that in minute detail. And really what we're seeking to identify is a tiny clue about the receiver of the shipment or who might have sent it. And the in-between part of those individuals is often a very complex maze. But we might find a tiny clue that will then lead us on to the next component, and that is the who. So we use this approach essentially to identify who's involved in crime and the networks they're part of. But also, crucially, the composition of those networks, so how those networks are made up. And that's really important for this particular problem. So here we can see a typical kind of network chart. We've got quite a lot of individuals on here, and each of them have a role that's been assigned to them. And that role that they play contributes to the overall functioning of the network. So we have suppliers, we have brokers, we have couriers. And each one of those holds a certain level of power and influence. So we use this approach to try and identify who are those individuals in the network with the most influence, with the most power, so that we can target those individuals. You may know, of course, that poachers and couriers are the people that are most commonly arrested for wildlife crimes. They're often arrested and convicted. Sometimes are sent to prison for a very long time. But the removal of those individuals has very little influence on the functioning of that criminal network. Those individuals are the most exposed and the most vulnerable, and the ones that can be very easily replaced. So once they're removed, they can just be replaced by another individual, and the network can continue to function as it always was. So what we seek to do is try and identify the whole network. Of course, we never identify the whole network. We know what we know. So we say we have these 20 individuals here, but what we want to do is identify who's causing the greatest harm. And by the removal of those 5 individuals, we can cause the network to collapse. So think about Jenga. So if you remove some crucial building blocks from that structure, it will collapse. And that's exactly the same effect we're trying to have here. And then if we move on to the next component of the 5WH, the why. So I'm not talking here about why is someone in Asia willing to purchase a product or consume a product that contains pangolin scales. I'm not the right person to answer that. The question I'm seeking to answer is why are criminals willing to facilitate this demand? And the answer is really quite simple. Wildlife crime is low risk, high reward. So the apprehension and especially the conviction of those high-level individuals is incredibly rare. Governments do still not recognize wildlife crime as a form of serious and organized crime. And because of this, the necessary resources to tackle crime at that level are just not available. And crime really does pay. Wildlife crime is now the 4th most profitable transnational crime after drug trafficking, counterfeiting, and human trafficking. So intelligence analysis is an incredibly important force multiplier where resources are low, and the problem is vast, such as wildlife trafficking. And it can have a really profound effect on crime levels. And this approach, of course, is transferable. So today I'm talking about pangolins, but next year I could be talking about penguins or pandas or any plant species that's very popular in your particular area. So this is more about the general problem and how we need to tackle it. And for anyone out there who wishes to know how they can help on this problem, best advice I could give you is try and stay informed. Learn what wildlife crime threats exist in your countries, because I guarantee there will be some everywhere. And demand that your government prepares an adequate response to it. So it's through our combined voices and approaches such as the ones that I've discussed today, we can help put more pressure on organised crime and not allow organised crime to put pressure on our vulnerable and endangered species in the wild. Okay, thank you.